Hi, I'm Nat, and right now I want to talk about the Canadian Bill C-18, or the Online News Act. Now, I've talked about this in the past, but this has now become law. This happened on June 22nd. And what this bill is supposed to do is help the dying Canadian mainstream media, essentially the news media, recoup some more money, even though they're already heavily subsidized by the Canadian government as it is. As we saw recently with Elon Musk's little spat over Twitter, where they labeled the CBC as state-sponsored media. The CBC got mad and said that they were not state-sponsored media, and then Elon Musk, after some research, ended up giving them a 69% state-sponsored media because that is the amount of money that they receive from the federal government. This means that they're not only state-sponsored and subsidized, but that now they have to admit it. Now, the Liberal government wanted to save this media because they are very positive in their coverage of the current government, even though the rest of us can see their actual mistakes, and this only makes the bias that is in traditional mainstream news the more evident. The mainstream media was also subsidized during the past elections, where we saw that they got a heavy amount of money, supposedly for COVID relief, but it was right before the elections, and, well, all their coverage was glowingly positive. All of this while independent news sources like True North, like Rebel News, and the few independent news sources we have here in Canada, were completely banned from even entering the debates or even asking questions that the people have to the ones that were trying to get elected by those very same people. And what this bill would do has been deemed a link tax, because the links that are shared on social media platforms or platforms in general, like Google, or the boosting of certain links above others regarding news would now be taxed, which means that the social media platforms and platforms would have to pay to have those links up on their sites. So if you would see a Google link that appears first, because it ranks first, coming from CBC, Google would now have to pay to have the honor of hosting that link on their platform. And of course, Meta and Google, Meta is Facebook's parent company, were not very happy about this because they're already giving the space and giving the ad revenue that comes with those clicks of links to the Canadian mainstream news and to all of those sites. And there was this big issue that was also coming because the CRTC, which is the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, would have the power to arbitrate who needs to pay what to the mainstream news. And this was also worrying for a lot of us because the CRTC would now be in charge of deciding who they deem as a trustworthy journalistic enterprise and who would be deserving of those tax revenues. And of course, independent media that is already pretty much hated by the current government and by any other government because they uncover the truth and they look beyond the party lines that are given to them most of the time. Well, they of course would not be deemed as journalistic enterprises, so they wouldn't get any revenue, and they would have probably gotten deranked and deboosted even further on search results and from appearing on Facebook or Instagram, for example. And Google and Meta, of course, went, hey, wait a minute, this makes no sense. Because anybody with a cursory or passing knowledge of how ad revenue works knows that whenever you mention clicks and that makes money, or even clickbait, it's important to get clicks on links because that is what drives an audience to your platform or your site, where you have then advertisements that they will inevitably scroll by, and that is what generates revenue. And that is how most sites online and most journalistic enterprises and just sites in general get paid. That's why getting clicks on those links are important for almost every news outlet out there. Because by getting people to look at their content on their own site, they're able to also get them to watch those ads that play either on the sides or on video, and that is how they get paid by the advertisers. So putting a tax on those links makes no sense, because this would mean that now the Canadian government wants the traditional news outlets to get paid not only by them and by subscriptions and other ways of generating revenue, but also by the hosts of the links that would actually get them to get more audience to their own sites. It makes absolutely no sense to anybody that thinks about it for more than 2 seconds. And one person that clearly wasn't thinking about this at all, but was pushing it through nonetheless, was Canadian Heritage Minister with the very Canadian name of Pablo Rodriguez, who is an Argentinian who's been here for a while and is now in charge of taking care of the Canadian heritage. He was the one that was pushing all this through. And now that Google and Meta have called their bluff and said, no, we're not paying for it, we're not even putting the links up on our sites, so now there's less traditional mainstream news media on Facebook and Google, which is a good thing in a way. Well, now Pablo Rodriguez is very angry at the fact that Google and Meta thought that this was as ridiculous as it is, and is now threatening to remove the Canadian ad spending on those sites, which means we'll get less ads from the Canadian government, which, I mean, I don't know about you, but getting less propaganda is always a good thing, not a bad thing. So let's see what the Canadian Heritage Minister, Pablo Rodriguez, said when he announced that he is now dropping or suspending all government advertising on Facebook and Instagram.
The platforms don't have any obligations under the Act, none. And despite this, Facebook has decided to be unreasonable, irresponsible, and started blocking news. This is why, today, we are announcing the Government of Canada will be suspending advertising on Facebook and Instagram. And this is exactly what Canadians are expecting. So today, we're calling on both platforms to stay at the table, work through the regulatory process with us, contribute their fair share, and keep news on their platforms. It's good.
So he wants to shake down now Meta and Google and tell them, we won't give you our money if you won't give us, or well, our news outlets that do our bidding for us, all the money for just linking things on your platforms, which is ridiculous. But I mean, not getting those ads that say, go get your 10th booster because it's super necessary, this message is sponsored by the Canadian government, isn't a bad thing. That's actually a good thing that the Canadian government is suspending the money that they would have been spending on ads on these platforms. So that just means we'll have to see them even less now, which is good.
For the platforms, good for news in Canada, good for Canadians, good for our democracy.
And you'll see both the super Canadian Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez from Argentina and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau mention democracy when they talk about this, and how this is hurting democracy and it's not good for democracy that Google and Meta are doing this. Because now when you look for a news story, you're not just getting the state-sponsored CBC, CTV, all of the typical ones, but you're getting an array of news sources and news sites that don't have as much bias as the traditional Canadian news media has. And this is all thanks to Justin Trudeau and Pablo Rodriguez. So in a way, they are democratizing news, only that this is happening because they did it completely backwards. So let's watch what Justin Trudeau had to say about this. He doubled down on his government's attack on Meta after announcing they will no longer be advertising.
Your heritage minister says he believes there is a way forward with Google, but with Meta, as you've said, your government has now suspended all advertising. How far will your government go in taking on a company like Meta? What could be next?
This is not just a dispute over advertising, it's also a dispute over democracy. It's a question of recognizing the role that internet giants like Facebook, Meta, Google, and others have in our lives, and therefore a responsibility that they also wield. As we've said, we're continuing constructive conversations with Google. Unfortunately, Facebook has just refused to recognize any sort of responsibility it might have.
Because they have no responsibility to pay for the links that you're putting on their site. Because it is completely ridiculous to ask of them to do that. And I am not defending big social media tech giants, of course not. But the fact that they think that they have any responsibility towards paying for the content that is hosted on their sites is ridiculous. If it's now generating ad revenue directly, and you just want them to pay for those links to generate even more ad revenue once you've translated all the audience towards your own page, it makes no sense for them financially. They'd be losing money. Imagine if this happened in every country. I mean, they'd go bankrupt, and as big companies that want to make more money, this sounds completely absurd and ridiculous to them. And we also saw him mentioning the little democracy line, how it's hurting democracy.
In contributing to a democracy that has, democracies in general that have contributed to its success as a company, as a corporation. So we're not backing down on this. This goes to the core of a free and informed society that is able to take responsible decisions in a democracy. Citizens need to have access to quality local news, to quality content, to quality journalism that is properly paid. And the fact that
And now they do. Now they do have access to quality journalism and to local news outlets as well. Only you don't have the control over what those things say anymore, because you're not able to blast those at the top of any search result or at the top of any Facebook inquiry or anyone sharing something on Facebook, because you have no longer that control. So what they're scared about is losing that control. And that is what they're calling that democracy that they're losing. But it's not democracy. It's them losing control over the narrative and now scrambling and getting all angry and saying democracy about 20 different times.
That the media, that Facebook doesn't want to recognize the hard work of professional journalists across the country is something that undermines the very fabric of our democracy at a time where we're seeing democracy backslide around the world. So Canada and allies around the world are going to stand strong and demonstrate that we will not flinch in our defense of fundamental, foundational principles to democracy, like...
How about instead of expecting that everybody else pays for your propaganda narrative machine, you start asking them to produce quality content that would actually get them any sort of revenue by willing readers that see this as a worthy thing to spend money on, instead of expecting everybody else to pay for it because it benefits you and your government. And luckily for all of us, both Meta and Google seem to not be backing down from their positions of, no, we will not pay for your ridiculous demands, and we will not pay for you to put links on our platforms. So this is what Google said recently. They said an update on Canada's Bill C-18. So Bill C-18 has become law and remains unworkable. The government has not given us reason to believe that the regulatory process will be able to resolve structural issues with the legislation, that it is ridiculous. As a result, we have informed the government that we have made the difficult decision that when the law takes effect, we will be removing links to Canadian news from our Search, News and Discover products and will no longer be able to operate Google News Showcase in Canada. And we have seen this take effect. Again, if you search anything now on Google, you'll get a wide array of news sources from all over the world rather than those that are tailored specifically to those that are viewing it in Canada. So they say the Government of Canada has enacted a new law called Bill C-18, the Online News Act, requiring two companies to pay for simply showing links to news, something that everyone else does for free. The unprecedented decision to put a price on links, a so-called link tax, creates uncertainty for our products and exposes us to uncapped financial liability simply for facilitating Canadians' access to news from Canadian publishers. We have been saying for over a year that this is the wrong approach to supporting journalism in Canada and may result in significant changes to our products. Of course it does. Of course it does. And just lastly here from True North, they have a whole timeline of how this fiasco happened and how we are where we are now, which I will add in the end is actually a better place than most wanted to believe that it would be when it first came out. But there's a little part down here that exactly specifies why this makes no sense for the platforms themselves. So the tech giants argue that they have done enough to support Canadian news through their various initiatives and programs. Google says they've already negotiated agreements with 150 Canadian news publications as part of their News Showcase program, whereby they've linked to Canadian outlets 3.6 billion times in 2022 at no charge. Google estimates that this traffic is valued at $250 million annually, because as I explained, whenever somebody clicks on a link, that leads them to a website that will have ads, which through those eyeballs, through somebody clicking on that link, they're generating revenue because the advertisers see how many times their ads got seen by whoever's looking at the platform. Meta, on the other hand, say they provide Canadian news outlets $230 million in value through the 1.9 billion link clicks the last 12 months on Facebook. On top of that, Meta says they've invested approximately $18 million in Canadian news organizations through partnerships and programs. So this is why it makes absolutely no sense for the demands from Trudeau's Liberal government and super Canadian, non-Canadian Pablo Rodriguez, Heritage Minister. And as I've kept mentioning, I think this is actually a good thing for the health and the ecosystem of news in Canada. Because for a very long time, we kept only having the traditional mainstream news outlets pushed on us through these social media platforms. And while a lot of independent news media and media in general were a little scared that this bill was going to pass, it has now become, because of the absolute fiasco they've made it into by Google and Meta calling the bluff of the government, and by the inadequacy to even understand how online revenue works, well, this now benefits anybody that is interested in unbiased news, because now you're able to get it easier. Not only that, but by the Canadian Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez's removal of advertisements from Meta, well, now we won't get propagandized by the Canadian government telling us to get more and more boosters. So all in all, we all win. And people now have more of an opportunity to discover those independent news outlets when they're searching for news, because they're not being as blocked and censored as they once were, because this government partnership with social media platforms seems to be fracturing a little bit, and that only benefits all of us and the health of Canadian news. But for now, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.